Francis was born in a vibrant Assisi in the midst of social effervescence. The son of a prosperous cloth merchant, Pietro Bernardone, and Pica, a devout woman of French origin, he was raised in a home that combined wealth and tradition. From childhood, Francis had everything that his father's gold could buy at his disposal. Fine clothes, lavish banquets, and luxurious parties were part of his routine. Young Francis lived surrounded by friends and enjoyed a carefree youth marked by a constant search for pleasure. His steps always led him towards fairs and popular festivities, where he could be the center of attention, singing, dancing, and telling stories. However, his contagious joy hid a growing emptiness in his heart, even though he could not yet name it. In his adolescence, Francis began to nurture the dream of becoming a knight, an ideal that at the time meant much more than the pursuit of adventures. Being a knight was the ultimate aspiration for a young man of his lineage, representing the attainment of honor, recognition, and power. He deeply admired the figures of the knights who went off to the Crusades, men clad in shining armor who personified bravery and courage. In his fantasies, he envisioned himself donning golden armor, riding an imposing horse, and leading armies in the name of his family's glory and prestige. But Francis was not just a young man longing for adventures and material conquests. His mother, Pica, had planted seeds of faith in him from an early age. She told him stories about Jesus Christ and the saints who dedicated their lives to the service of God and the poor. These stories did not leave him indifferent, although at the time he kept them tucked away in a deep corner of his heart. His exuberant nature and desire for recognition distanced him from the path of spirituality. Francis could not yet reconcile the desire for greatness with the inner calling that was beginning to arise, albeit very subtly. The great turning point came when Francis had his first real experience with war. At 20, he eagerly enlisted to fight in the war between Assisi and Perugia. However, the conflict he had so eagerly anticipated confronted him with the brutality and chaos of the battlefield. The young man, who until then knew life only through celebrations and abundance, was plunged into the horror of war. The sight of his dead friends around him, the blood staining the plains that once seemed so distant from his reality, and the deafening sound of combat shook him profoundly. Fate dealt him an even harsher blow. Captured by the enemy army, Francis was taken to a prison in Perugia. The boy who dreamed of glory and titles now found himself chained, powerless, living in inhumane conditions. In the months he spent in that dark, damp environment, Francis was forced to confront the fragility of life and his own impotence. His aspirations for greatness crumbled little by little. What had once seemed so important, the wealth, the recognition, the status, began to lose its luster. That young man who once shone at the parties in Assisi now found himself enveloped by the darkness of the prison and the absence of hope. But it was precisely at that moment, in the depths of his despair, that Francis began to feel something different. He started to realize that his life could not be defined by material possessions or titles, and that there was something much deeper and truer awaiting him. In the silence of the prison, he began to pray. His prayers were simple, made almost intuitively, but gradually gained intensity. Although he still did not have clear answers, he felt that something was happening inside him. It was as if the physical captivity was freeing his soul from a much greater bondage, the prison of pride and vanity. After nearly a year of captivity, Francis was freed through the payment of a ransom made by his father. Upon returning to Assisi, he was no longer the same. His friends noticed the difference, but he still could not explain what he was feeling. He tried to resume his previous life, participating in the same parties and social circles, but he no longer found the same joy in the activities that had once excited him so much. Something inside him urged him to seek more, to seek something that could fill the emptiness that wealth and pleasure could not satisfy. It was during this period of uncertainty that Francis, still wishing to become a knight, decided to embark on a new war. He was determined to achieve the prestige he so desired, but during the journey to Spoleto, God intervened once again. Francis had a dream that would mark him forever. In it, he saw a great palace adorned with weapons and shields, symbols of victory. As he approached, he heard a voice ask, "Francis, who can reward you better, the servant or the Lord?" Stunned by the clarity of the dream, Francis replied, "The Lord." The voice then said to him, "Why do you seek the servant and not the Lord?" Awakened by the dream, Francis understood that his path was wrong. He would return to Assisi without fighting, without military glory. The weapons and titles he so desired had completely lost their meaning. This was the moment when Francis, still not fully understanding what this meant, decided to dedicate his life to something greater. Upon returning to Assisi, he abandoned his knightly aspirations, even though he still did not have a clear vision of what he would do next. Francis's friends were puzzled by his sudden change. The one who had once been the most enthusiastic about parties now preferred to isolate himself, seek silence, and walk the hills around Assisi. Francis felt a deep desire to connect with something greater, but he did not yet know how to respond to that calling. His steps led him to prayer, to the search for simplicity, and to the contemplation of the beauties of nature. And amidst this quest, Francis began to realize that true greatness was not found in battles or titles, but in serving God and others. It was during this period of transformation that he first encountered the lepers living on the margins of society. Previously, like everyone in his town, Francis felt aversion toward these people, and his own nature kept him from approaching them. However, something inside him began to change. He felt an uncontrollable urge to draw near to the marginalized, to understand their pain, and to share in their misery. This impulse led him to meet a leper who would forever change the course of his life. Francis, mounted on his horse, spotted a leper by the roadside. His instincts first urged him to distance himself, but at that moment something stronger spoke to his heart. He dismounted from his horse, approached the man covered in wounds, and embraced him. In that embrace, Francis experienced a peace he had never felt before. The repulsion that had once dominated him was replaced by a deep, unconditional love. It was as if, by touching that leper, Francis were touching Christ himself. This encounter was not merely an act of charity, it marked the turning point of his inner conversion, the beginning of a life completely devoted to love, humility, and service. From that moment on, Francis began to frequent the places where the lepers lived. He brought them food, tended to their wounds, and above all offered them his time and attention. He, who had once sought the company of the noble and powerful, now found meaning in serving the most despised. After Francis returned to Assisi, his life would never be the same. The experiences he had lived during his captivity in Perugia and the mysterious voice he had heard during his journey to Spoleto still echoed in his mind. He was no longer the carefree young man yearning for military honors and riches. Something greater was being born within him, an unrest that led him to question everything that had once seemed certain. Francis began to gradually distance himself from the parties and celebrations he once cherished, and his friends noticed this change. He no longer fit into the world of excess and frivolity that had once attracted him so much. However, Francis's transformation was not immediate. There was a deep internal conflict consuming him. In his soul, there still existed a struggle between the dreams of glory he had carried since childhood and the quieter yet persistent calling for something very different, something he could not yet define clearly. It was during this period of uncertainty that Francis began to seek comfort in prayer, something that until then had only been a superficial part of his life. He frequented the churches of Assisi and began to find a strange solace in the silence of the small temples, far from the clamor of the streets and the festivities, but doubts remained. Young Francis found himself torn between the desires of his flesh, which pulled him toward old ambitions and pleasures, and the deep calling of his soul, which now yearned for a life of service. This intimate battle was one of the most painful for him, as Francis felt as if he were lost, unsure of which path to follow. Although he was closer to God, he still had not understood what his mission would be, and this troubled him deeply. It was then that one of the most significant moments of his life occurred, the encounter with the leper. Leprosy in the Middle Ages was much more than a physical disease. Lepers were seen as cursed, unclean, and cast out from all aspects of social life. They were condemned to live on the margins, often excluded from their own religious community, as their condition was associated with divine punishment. Francis, like any man of his time, also felt aversion to these wretched souls. The sight of a leper filled him with disgust and horror. One day, while riding through the fields of Assisi, Francis spotted a disfigured figure in the distance. As he approached, he recognized the unmistakable features of a leper. Instinctively, he felt the urge to turn away. His heart raced and a chill ran down his spine. The leper's skin, ravaged by disease, was a sight Francis did not want to face. He prepared to divert his path, as he had always done, but something stopped him. Amidst his repulsion, he felt a soft yet firm inner voice inviting him to do the opposite of what his body demanded. In that moment, Francis dismounted from his horse, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly he walked toward the leper. Each step seemed to challenge his nature, and the distance between him and the sick man felt greater than it was. When he finally reached him, a deep silence enveloped them both. Francis, taking a deep breath, extended his hand and touched the man, a gesture that would be unthinkable for many. But Francis went further. He embraced the leper, feeling the roughness of the diseased skin against his own. It was as if, in that instant, all of his fears, prejudices, and repulsions dissolved in a gesture of love. By touching that marginalized man, Francis felt a peace he had never experienced before. It was not a superficial peace, but a tranquility that touched his soul. That action, so simple yet so courageous, marked the beginning of a true conversion. It was there, in that unexpected embrace, that Francis began to more clearly understand the calling that God was making to him. The love he felt when embracing the leper did not come from himself, but from something much greater. Through that act, he was learning what it truly meant to love as Christ loved, without distinctions, without fear, without judgments. After the encounter with the leper, Francis was never the same. He began to seek a life of prayer and service more intensely. Many times, he would go to the outskirts of Assisi, visiting the places where lepers lived in isolation. He brought them food, water, and clothing, but above all, he brought them hope. He talked to them, listened to their stories, and in every word exchanged with those despised men and women, Francis felt as if he was speaking directly to Christ. In those faces disfigured by disease, he found the face of the Lord. But this inner transformation was not easy for Francis. By deciding to serve the poorest and most marginalized, he faced resistance and misunderstanding from everyone around him. His friends, who had accompanied him to parties and celebrations, now looked at him strangely. Francis, who had once been the charismatic leader of the youth of Assisi, was now seen as an eccentric, someone who had lost his mind. Even his family, especially his father, Pietro, began to show discontent with Francis's choices. Pietro had invested so much in his son, hoping that he would take over the family business, continuing the wealth and prestige he valued so highly. Pietro could not understand why Francis, who had everything at his disposal, chose to walk with the poor and the sick. He tried in every way to bring his son back to reason, offering him more riches, more business opportunities, more parties. But Francis no longer cared about such things. His heart had been transformed. He no longer sought earthly glories, and this increasingly distanced him from his former life. It was during this time that Francis began to frequent the small chapel of San Damiano, an old and crumbling church located on the outskirts of Assisi. There, amid the crumbling walls, Francis spent hours in prayer. One day, while kneeling before the crucifix that hung over the altar, he heard a voice calling him by name. "Francis," said the voice, "rebuild my church which is in ruins." Francis, without hesitating, took those words literally. He left the chapel determined to restore the physical building, believing this was his mission. He began to ask passers-by for stones and materials, and with his own hands, he started the reconstruction work. To finance the project, Francis sold some fabrics and belongings from his father's shop. When Pietro learned of this, he became furious. He could not comprehend how his son was spending the family's wealth on such an absurd venture. In his view, the relationship between the two deteriorated rapidly. Pietro, indignant, demanded that Francis return everything he had taken. But Francis, instead of yielding, made a radical decision. In a gesture that symbolized his complete renunciation of material wealth and a life of privilege, Francis stripped in front of the Bishop of Assisi and the entire city. He returned to his father everything he owned, including his clothes, and stood naked, in an act representing his total surrender to God. At that moment, Francis was no longer the son of Pietro Bernardone, the wealthy merchant. He had chosen another path, the path of poverty, humility, and service. From that day on, his life would be entirely dedicated to rebuilding not only the Church of San Damiano, but also the Church of Christ, as he would soon come to understand. This total surrender, this courage to renounce everything the world had to offer, marked Francis of Assisi as one of the greatest examples of faith and holiness. He realized that his mission was not merely to restore a crumbling chapel, but to revitalize the very church, calling it back to the simplicity and radical love that Christ preached. After the episode in which Francis publicly renounced wealth and distanced himself from his father, the city of Assisi was filled with a mixed curiosity of astonishment and contempt. The young man, once known for his eccentricity and charisma, now seemed to have plunged into behavior that many considered madness. The son of prosperous Pietro Bernardone was begging in the streets and dedicating his hands to the hard work of reconstructing a ruined chapel. What others saw as humiliation and downfall, Francis embraced with a joy that defied understanding. His faith was deepening, and this new chapter of his life would mark his total commitment to the mission that God had entrusted to him. The chapel of San Damiano, where Francis first heard the voice calling him to rebuild my church, became his refuge. It was not just a physical place of prayer, but a symbol of the spiritual transformation he was undergoing. The reconstruction of the small church was arduous, both physically and emotionally. He worked with his own hands, collecting stones from the surroundings, carrying heavy burdens, and begging for alms to obtain the missing materials. With each stone laid, he felt that his own soul was being rebuilt, purified of the impurities of his former life. Francis understood that this work was not merely a restoration of a building, but the prelude to a greater and deeper mission, still unknown to him. Even while working on the chapel, Francis began to attract the attention of others. Initially, there were curious glances, but over time, a small group of men began to follow his journey. Some of these men were, like him, disillusioned with a life of excess and worldly pleasures. They saw in Francis someone who seemed to have found a greater meaning in life, something they themselves were secretly seeking. Little by little, they began to follow his example, imitating his simplicity and eventually adopting the lifestyle that Francis now embodied. It wasn't long before Francis realized that God was calling him to more than just the physical reconstruction of churches. He who had once sought applause and recognition began to preach in the streets of Assisi and in the small villages around. His words were not those of a learned man, but the simplicity with which he spoke of God's love and the need for repentance deeply touched hearts. Francis did not seek to convince anyone with intellectual arguments or theological debates. He spoke of what he lived, of the love that transformed him daily, and of the call to radical poverty, something he saw as an imitation of Christ's life. In 1209, Francis was no longer alone. A small group of followers formed around him, and together they began to live in community, strictly following the teachings of Jesus. They adopted the name Lesser Brothers, a name that reflected Francis's deep desire to always place himself below others in humility and service. The word lesser was not just a linguistic choice. It was an expression of the commitment to live without anything, without possessions, without rights. Francis and his brothers dedicated themselves to a life of extreme simplicity, sustained by manual labor and charity. Living poverty in its most radical form, however, was not without challenges. The nascent community of lesser brothers faced immense difficulties. They slept outdoors or in small straw huts, wore simple wool tunics, and often had little to eat. Hunger and need often accompanied them, but what would be a reason for despair for many was a reason for joy for Francis and his brothers. They considered themselves blessed to share in the poverty of Christ and the apostles. With each need that arose, Francis encouraged his brothers to trust entirely in divine providence. And, almost miraculously, they always found someone willing to give them the little they had. Francis's way of life, however, awakened more than just curiosity and admiration. Criticism was not lacking. Many, especially among the clergy, saw the movement as a threat to the established order. Francis's radical lifestyle, with its preaching of extreme poverty and a return to the simplest roots of the gospel, challenged the wealth and power accumulated by many ecclesiastical institutions of the time. However, Francis was not shaken by the criticisms. He did not wish to reform the church from the outside in, but believed that true reform began in the heart of each individual, in personal conversion and total surrender to God. The inner call that Francis felt led him to Rome, where he sought papal approval for his order. It was a bold step, for despite his simplicity and humility, Francis knew that the mission God had entrusted to him required the official acceptance of the Church. Together with his companions, Francis traveled to the Vatican and, in a humble manner, presented himself to Pope Innocent III. The meeting with the Pope was one of the most significant moments in Francis's life. Innocent III, known for his authority and political acumen, initially looked with distrust at the ragged young man and his followers. They seemed at first glance like a group of beggars, without any formal education or structure. However, Francis's humility and sincerity soon touched the heart of the pontiff. Tradition says that on the night before the audience with Francis, Innocent III had a dream in which he saw the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the mother church of all churches, about to collapse, supported only by a poor man whom he identified as Francis. This dream was interpreted as a divine sign that Francis and his movement were destined to revitalize the church in a time of crisis. The next day, the Pope orally approved the Franciscan rule, allowing Francis and his brothers to continue their mission. The papal recognition was a milestone for Francis, but it did not change his way of living. Even with Rome's approval, he and his brothers continued to live in extreme poverty, preaching the gospel in the streets, helping the needy, and calling people to conversion. What attracted those who listened to Francis was not so much what he said, but how he lived. He embodied the words he preached, and his testimony of life spoke louder than any speech. Over the years, the order of lesser brothers grew rapidly. Men from all social backgrounds, from peasants to nobles, began to follow Francis. They were drawn by his simplicity, joy, and ability to see God in all things. However, this growth also brought new challenges. As the order expanded, Francis felt he was losing control over the movement he had initiated. Some of his followers began to suggest adaptations to the rule of life to make it more practical or sustainable over time. Francis, however, resisted any changes that would dilute the original ideal of poverty and simplicity. For him, the essence of the gospel lay precisely in renunciation of power and possessions. Even in the face of these tensions, Francis never abandoned his humility. He saw himself not as a leader or founder of a great order, but as a servant of God, a lesser brother. His concern was not with the success or longevity of his movement, but with fidelity to the calling that God had made to him. This fidelity, often expressed in small, everyday acts of service and sacrifice, is what made Francis one of the most beloved and revered figures in the history of the Church. Throughout these years of expansion of the order, Francis never strayed from his initial mission to preach the simplicity of the gospel and live in communion with the poorest. He continued to visit lepers, care for the sick, and preach in the streets. Though surrounded by crowds who admired him, Francis never allowed himself to be deceived by fame. His heart remained fixed on what he believed to be essential: love for God and love for his neighbor, lived out radically and without reservations. The deepest turning point in the life of Francis of Assisi occurred during a time when he had fully embraced his mission to preach poverty and serve the poor. But what followed would reveal an even more intimate and vulnerable side of his spirituality: his relationship with nature, not just as God's creation, but as a reflection of the Creator. This moment of spiritual maturation was marked by a profound connection that Francis established with all creatures, culminating in the creation of his most famous and beloved work, the Canticle of Creatures. However, to understand the impact of this phase on his life, one must delve into his emotions, internal upheavals, and crises that led him to see nature in such a close and spiritual way. During those years, Francis was already known as a deeply simple man, devoted to his mission and tireless in his journey of faith. He walked barefoot through the fields, his body covered only by a modest tunic, and lived in constant communion with the marginalized and the sick. But it was during one of his many solitary walks around Assisi, when he sought refuge in the hills and woods, that he began to perceive a more tangible divine presence in everything around him. The trees, the birds, the rivers, and even the gently blowing wind were to him manifestations of God's love. It was in this context that Francis began to develop a broader understanding of creation. For him, nature was not merely something beautiful or useful, but an integral part of the divine work, something with which he could relate directly. Francis spoke to the birds as if they were his brothers, and to the wind he offered his prayers with the same reverence he showed before the altar. He saw the sun not just as a distant star, but as a symbol of God's light and goodness, and he called water sister, for it, like him, reflected purity and simplicity. Francis's life during this period was deeply marked by contemplation. He spent long periods alone, immersed in prayer, and his prayers were not requests or supplications, but praises. He praised God for all the small and great wonders of creation. It was in the simplicity of these moments, when he sat in the shade of a tree or by the edge of a stream, that Francis experienced a peace so profound that it seemed to transcend human life itself. But the depth of his experience with nature did not arise solely from love. It also stemmed from pain. At this point, Francis was already suffering from serious health issues. His body, worn down by rigorous fasting and intense physical work, began to fail. He suffered from a debilitating eye disease, and his vision, which had once delighted him with the beauties of the world around him, was starting to wane. The man who had lived to see goodness in everything and everyone was gradually losing the ability to see. However, even amid this suffering, Francis found a way to praise. He transformed his pain into gratitude and his loss of vision into an opportunity to see with the eyes of the soul. It was during this period of physical fragility and intense spiritual contemplation that Francis composed the Canticle of Creatures, one of the most sublime expressions of his spirituality. In his words, a childlike simplicity and a mature faith shine through. He praised Sister Moon and the stars, Brother Wind and Sister Water, as well as Sister Bodily Death, which he knew was approaching rapidly. Francis did not fear death. On the contrary, he saw it as a companion on his journey, a sister who would lead him to the ultimate encounter with God. The Canticle of Creatures was not just a poem of praise, but also a reflection of how Francis related to the world. He deeply believed that all creatures, no matter how small or insignificant, were worthy of respect and love, for each one bore the mark of the Creator. This was evident in his compassion for animals. On many occasions, Francis was seen preaching to the birds, urging them to praise God with their songs. And once he convinced a fierce wolf to make peace with a village that feared its attacks. The episode of the Wolf of Gubbio is one of the best-known stories from Francis's life. The town of Gubbio lived in terror of a ferocious wolf that attacked both livestock and people venturing outside the city walls. The frightened residents did not know how to deal with the situation. It was then that Francis, upon learning of the situation, decided to intervene. Unarmed and without any protection, he walked to the woods where the wolf was hiding. Upon encountering the animal, Francis showed no fear. He approached the wolf calmly and spoke to it as if he were conversing with a friend. The account states that the wolf, upon hearing Francis's words, suddenly calmed down and became docile. Francis explained to the wolf that its attacks were causing fear and suffering, but he also acknowledged that the animal acted out of necessity as it was hungry. He then proposed a pact between the wolf and the inhabitants of Gubbio. The wolf would stop attacking, and in return the residents would ensure it had enough food to survive. The wolf accepted the pact, and the town, impressed by Francis's faith and courage, came to respect even more the man who spoke to God's creatures as if they were his brothers. This episode was not isolated, but exemplified the kind of relationship Francis maintained with the natural world. He did not see creatures as inferior or subservient to man, but as part of a great family, all children of the same Creator. His reverence for nature was, in fact, an expression of his reverence for God, and the way he treated animals and the land around him was an extension of his love for Christ. However, while Francis found joy and solace in nature, he also knew that his mission took him beyond the woods and hills of Assisi. His health was declining, but his soul remained vigorous, and he felt there was still much to be done. Even weakened, he did not give up on traveling and preaching. Francis set off for Egypt in a bold attempt to engage in dialogue with the Sultan Malik al-Kamil during the Crusades. His goal was not forced conversion or confrontation, but peace. Francis believed that through dialogue and love, it would be possible to find a way of understanding between Christians and Muslims. Although the meeting with the Sultan did not result in lasting peace between the peoples, Francis was received with respect and admiration. The Sultan, impressed by Francis's courage and humility, allowed him and his companions to preach in Muslim lands. This episode demonstrated the breadth of Francis's love, which was not limited to his own community or faith, but extended to all human beings, regardless of their background or belief. Upon returning from the Holy Land, Francis was even more physically weakened, but spiritually, his heart overflowed with peace. He knew that his time on earth was coming to an end and began to prepare for his death with the same serenity and joy with which he had lived his entire life. To his brothers, he always said not to fear death, but to embrace it as part of the divine plan. Francis requested to be taken back to Assisi, where he wanted to spend his last days. In the simplicity that had marked his whole life, he chose to die outdoors, lying on the bare ground, in communion with the earth he loved so much. In October 1226, surrounded by his brothers, Francis of Assisi surrendered his spirit, not with lamentations or anguish, but singing praises to God, grateful for life and for all that it had given him. The year 1224 marked one of the most mystical and, at the same time, most painful phases of Francis of Assisi's life. By this point, he had already consolidated the fraternity of the Lesser Brothers. His message of radical poverty resonated in different regions, and he had received the recognition of the Pope. However, Francis, who always sought to live in the image of Christ, still felt that his sacrifice was not complete. This feeling would lead him to an intimate and definitive encounter with the Passion of Christ in a way he had never imagined. Mount Alverne, a remote and silent region in Tuscany, became Francis's spiritual refuge that year. He withdrew to this place in search of a time of isolation and deep contemplation, away from the crowds that were beginning to follow him in great numbers. For him, Mount Alverne represented more than a physical place of retreat. It was a space where the soul shed all distractions and sought with all its strength to unite with the mystery of God. Francis carried with him the desire to experience full communion with the suffering of Christ, and this desire drove him to seek a complete transformation. It was during this retreat on Mount Alverne that Francis began to intensify his prayers and fasts. He spent hours in deep contemplation, meditating on the Passion of Christ and the sacrifices made by the Lord for the salvation of humanity. Francis was not simply meditating on Jesus' suffering from a distance. He wanted to feel in his own flesh, in his own spirit, the pain and love that Jesus had experienced on Calvary. His prayers became increasingly intense, to the point that he wept profusely while contemplating the cross. On September 14, 1224, the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, Francis experienced one of the most extraordinary moments of his life. Amid his prayers, he had a vision of a seraph with 6 wings, resplendent and glorious, hovering above him. The seraph, who took the form of a crucified Christ, looked at Francis with indescribable love, and Francis was filled with a sense of ecstasy and pain at the same time. He felt such a deep communion with the Passion of Christ that when the vision disappeared, he realized that his body had been marked by the 5 wounds of Jesus. The wounds, known as stigmata, appeared on his hands, feet, and side and began to bleed. Francis felt intense pain, but at the same time immense peace flooded his soul. He, who had always sought to unite with Christ in a radical way, now bore in his own body the signs of his Lord's love and sacrifice. Francis had literally become one with Christ in his suffering. The wounds were not just external signs of his union with Jesus. They symbolized a profound internal transformation. Throughout his life, Francis had renounced everything: his wealth, his status, his family, and now he renounced even the comfort of his own body. He had fully and definitively embraced the cross. This moment was not a public victory for Francis. In fact, he tried to hide the stigmata from everyone. Only his closest companions knew of the pain he carried in secret. He did not want the focus to be on him, but rather on the message he preached: Christ's love for humanity, manifested most purely on the cross. The experience of the stigmata, however, brought with it a new phase of physical suffering. The pains were constant, and Francis, who was already fragile due to his illnesses, began to wither away rapidly. His body, so accustomed to austerity and deprivation, was now dealing with an even more intense pain and the gradual loss of strength. Nevertheless, he never complained. On the contrary, he continued to praise God for everything he experienced, seeing in every pain an opportunity to unite even more with the suffering Christ. Despite his weakened condition, Francisco continued to lead his brothers, albeit in a more discreet manner. He encouraged them to persevere in poverty and simplicity, and whenever he could, he preached about the importance of embracing the cross, viewing every suffering as a chance for spiritual growth. By this point, the Franciscan movement had grown significantly, and Francisco, who had always desired to be a lesser brother, began to worry about the direction his fraternity was taking. Many of the new members, attracted by the popularity of the order, started suggesting that it might be necessary to adapt some of the rules for the order to survive in the long term. This tension between Francisco's original vision and the practical challenges of the order's growth deeply troubled him. He feared that over time, the radical simplicity he cherished so much would be set aside in favor of a more sustainable organization. Francisco did not want his fraternity to become yet another rich and powerful institution within the church, but rather a movement that always lived on the margins, in communion with the poor and the humble. The thought that his brothers might in the future deviate from this ideal saddened him immensely. Despite his physical and emotional pain, Francisco continued to trust completely in God's providence. He knew that his mission was coming to an end, and that it would be up to his brothers to continue the work he had begun. Francisco never considered himself the leader or founder of a great movement. He saw himself as a simple servant, an instrument in God's hands. Even bearing the stigmata of Christ on his body, he remained humble, insisting that true merit lay not in his actions, but in the divine grace that sustained him. In the last months of his life, Francisco returned to Assisi to be near his closest brothers and friends. Sensing that his death was approaching, he requested to be taken back to Porciuncula, the small chapel that had been the birthplace of his fraternity. There, he wanted to spend his final moments in prayer, surrounded by the simplicity and love that had always defined his life. In his last days, Francisco composed a final stanza for the Canticle of the Creatures, praising Sister, bodily death. He welcomed her with the same serenity with which he had welcomed all other creatures, seeing in her not an end, but a passage to the fullness of life in God. On the night of October 3rd, 1226, Francisco, lying on the bare ground, with his eyes turned to the sky, surrounded by his brothers, surrendered his spirit. There was no despair, no lament. Francisco died as he lived, with simplicity, humility, and absolute trust in God's love. He departed in the same way he came into the world, stripped of everything except the faith that had accompanied him throughout his journey. After his death, the impact of his life and teachings was felt throughout the Church. Francis of Assisi, the man who renounced all riches and chose the path of radical poverty, became one of the most beloved and venerated saints in all of Christendom. His example of humility, compassion, and unconditional love continues to inspire generations, and his message of simplicity remains as relevant today as it was in his time. The lesser brothers, whom Francisco cared for so deeply, continued to grow and spread his message throughout the world. And although the Franciscan order faced challenges and transformations over the centuries, Francisco's legacy remains intact. He did not merely found a religious order, he established a way of living the gospel that transcends time and space. The life of Francis of Assisi, marked by so many twists and turns, sacrifices and moments of deep communion with God, is a living testimony that true greatness does not reside in riches or power, but in the ability to love without measure, to serve others, and to embrace the cross with joy and gratitude. In the life of Francis of Assisi, every choice seemed to follow a path that took him further away from the standards of the world and closer to a divine reality, a reality in which he saw beauty and meaning where most only saw pain and deprivation. Already recognized as a spiritual leader, he remained faithful to the simplicity he had chosen from the beginning, even as the circumstances around him became more complex. It was in this simplicity that he faced one of the greatest challenges of his journey, the need to balance his inner calling with the growing external demands that arose as his fraternity expanded. In 1220, 4 years before receiving the stigmata, Francisco faced one of the most difficult trials of his life, the return from a failed missionary trip to the East. He had attempted to reach Egypt, hoping to meet Sultan Malik al-Kamil in a courageous effort to preach peace and the gospel amidst the backdrop of the Crusades. However, Francisco knew that his attempt at conversion would not yield immediate results, and his return to Assisi was marked by a mix of feelings. He felt on one hand that his mission had not yet been fully accomplished, but on the other hand, he began to perceive the internal challenges awaiting his growing fraternity. Upon returning, Francisco found his order in a moment of transition. The movement, which had started small, based on extreme simplicity and service to the poor, now attracted a large number of new followers. Many of these followers came with good intentions, but not all were prepared to embrace the rigorous poverty that Francis preached. As the fraternity expanded, questions and pressures arose from some brothers who believed that the order needed to be structured in a more formal way, with rules that were more adaptable to the practical needs of such a large group. This internal conflict was a blow to Francis, who had until then managed to maintain the purity of his ideal. He always envisioned his fraternity as a small group of lesser brothers, stripped of everything, living on the fringes of society and dedicating themselves entirely to the gospel. The idea of seeing this simplicity compromised in the name of institutional survival was painful for him. Francis did not wish to found a new, powerful organization within the church. He wanted to be an example of humility, someone who, like Christ, chose to be the least among men. The tension between Francis's vision and the needs of the order became evident in a particularly striking episode. While many of his brothers pressed for the creation of a more flexible rule, Francis, increasingly distressed, decided to renounce his formal leadership of the order. He believed that the spirit of the order was being threatened by ambitions of expansion and institutionalization. For him, the divine calling was not in large structures, but in the pure living of the gospel. By abdicating his position of leadership, Francis demonstrated the depth of his faith and his commitment to humility. He trusted that God would continue to guide the fraternity, even if he were not at the forefront. However, Francis did not completely distance himself from his brothers. Even without the formal title of leader, he continued to be the soul of the fraternity. He was always present, offering advice and spiritual support. But this renunciation of leadership brought him great relief, as he had always felt uncomfortable with power and authority. Now he could more fully dedicate himself to his life of prayer without the distractions of the administrative responsibilities that were beginning to weigh on him. This period of internal crisis, however, was also a time of great spiritual growth for Francis. Free from the pressures of leadership, he was able to devote himself entirely to what he loved most: contemplation and service to the poor. Francis spent increasing amounts of time in isolated places such as Mount Alverne, where his prayers became deeper and more intense. He sought an ever more intimate relationship with God, desiring above all to conform to the image of Christ. It was in this context that he began to realize that suffering, both physical and spiritual, was part of this conformity. Francis, who had always embraced poverty and simplicity as a way to imitate Christ, began to understand that true imitation of the Lord also involved the acceptance of suffering. He, who had already experienced so many deprivations, now saw his own body wasting away under the burden of diseases and wounds that accumulated over time. His health, which was already precarious, deteriorated rapidly after his return from the East. He suffered from a painful eye infection that often left him unable to see clearly. His joints, weakened by years of physical labor, became stiff and painful. However, Francis never complained. He accepted each pain as a form of communion with the crucified Christ. The brothers who lived with Francis during this phase of his life report that, despite his weakened physical state, he never lost his joy. Francis, who had made the Canticle of the Creatures a constant prayer of praise, continued to sing even in moments of greatest pain. For him, each drop of suffering was an opportunity to glorify God. With each passing day, Francis became more aware that his mission on earth was nearing its end, and he wished to live his last days in complete harmony with the Lord he loved so much. In 1224, upon receiving the stigmata on Mount Alverne, Francis sealed his union with Christ definitively. But this union did not come without pain. The wounds, which represented a mystical communion with the Passion of Jesus, also brought intense physical suffering. The stigmata, which he carefully concealed to avoid any form of vanity, bled and further weakened him. Reports say that even when his hands and feet were swollen and painful, Francis continued to serve his brothers with tenderness. He never allowed his suffering to become a barrier between himself and others. In the months that followed the reception of the stigmata, Francis underwent a profound introspection. He knew his time was short and began to prepare his soul for the final encounter with God. Francis increasingly withdrew into prayer, seeking an inner peace that he knew was essential for the moment of his death. However, even amidst this spiritual preparation, he did not cease to worry about the lesser brothers and the continuity of the fraternity. The end of Francis's life was marked by a serenity that impressed all around him. He, who had lived a life of great sacrifices, now approached death with complete acceptance. When he learned that the moment was near, he asked to be taken back to Porciuncula, the small chapel he had always considered his true spiritual home. There he wished to die as he had lived, in total simplicity. In his last days, Francis requested to be laid directly on the ground, in contact with the earth, in a final gesture of humility. Surrounded by his brothers, he began to recite the Canticle of the Creatures, praising God for all the wonders of creation, including sister bodily death, which he welcomed as a friend, not as an enemy. Francis faced death with the same lightness and joy with which he had faced the challenges of his life. On the night of October 3rd, 1226, Francis of Assisi surrendered his spirit to God. His departure was silent, devoid of any pomp, just as he wished. Francis had lived a life marked by renunciation, sacrifice, and a deep love for God and creation. And now he was leaving behind a legacy that would endure for centuries. His brothers, though deeply saddened, knew that Francis had fulfilled the fullness of his mission. He had indeed become one with Christ. Even after his death, the influence of Francis of Assisi only grew. His message of simplicity, love for creation, and service to the poorest continued to inspire generations. His life, marked by so many twists and sacrifices, became a living testimony that true greatness lies in humility and the ability to love without measure. The last years of Francis of Assisi's life were marked by an intense mix of physical pain and profound spiritual peace. Already weakened by illness and the marks of the stigmata he bore on his body, Francis was increasingly aware that his earthly journey was coming to an end. However, even amid this physical decline, his spirit remained indomitable, always directed toward God and the brothers who continued to grow in number around him. The final period of his life was not merely a time of suffering, but also of extraordinary communion with the divine, a communion that Francis had always sought with all the fervor of his soul. In 1225, a year before his death, Francis, already very weakened by illness, was taken to San Damiano for care. There, welcomed by Clare and her sisters, he experienced the affection of those who had always accompanied him spiritually. Clare of Assisi, his companion in faith from the beginning, was now a source of comfort, caring for the saint with the same dedication she showed to her community. The poor Clares, inspired by Francis's example, were like an extension of the Franciscan spirit itself, and their presence beside him in this final moment reflected the circle of love that Francis had cultivated throughout his life. Even in San Damiano, where he was surrounded by love and care, Francis found no relief from his pain. He was practically blind, and the constant inflammation in his eyes caused him great discomfort. With each passing day, the vision of the world he so loved and praised in the Canticle of the Creatures faded a little more. However, what could have been a reason for despair became for Francis an opportunity to deepen his faith even further. He no longer needed to see the beauties of creation with his physical eyes. Now he contemplated them with the eyes of his heart. His union with God and creation became even more intimate, even though suffering was a constant presence. It was during this time in San Damiano, amid the growing darkness of his vision, that Francis composed one of the most famous passages of his masterpiece, the Canticle of the Creatures. In a moment of immense physical and emotional pain, he wrote the verse that praised sister bodily death. For Francis, death was not a dark or terrifying end, but a natural and expected part of life, a sister whom he would welcome with the same gratitude with which he welcomed the sun, the moon, and the stars. This was the spirit of Francis, to see in every aspect of life, even in what others feared, an expression of God's love. The Canticle of the Creatures represented the essence of his spirituality, a spirituality that embraced everything with a simple and profound joy. During this final phase, Francis desired more than ever to live his radical poverty, the same he had defended since the beginning of his conversion. He insisted on being treated simply, refusing any type of luxury or comfort that could distract him from his complete dependence on God. Even when his brothers suggested some relief for his pains, he asked for only the minimum, wishing, until the last moment, to be in communion with the poorest and the suffering. His identification with the marginalized, the sick, and the abandoned had never been stronger than in that period when he himself was on the brink of death. Francis knew that his death was near, and this awareness brought him a tranquility that surprised everyone around him. He no longer worried about the expansion of his order or the administrative issues that often troubled him. He left everything in God's hands, fully trusting that, just as his mission had been guided by the Lord up to that moment, it would continue without him. Francis had learned to let go of control, to allow the Holy Spirit to guide his work, and this gave him indescribable peace. Even at the end, Francis maintained his tenderness with his brothers. He was not an authoritarian leader, but rather a lesser brother, always willing to serve. During this time, he called the brothers to his side and blessed them one by one, conveying his last words of encouragement and love. For Francis, fraternity was not just a religious community. It was a living reflection of the communion between God and humanity. Each brother was for him a manifestation of divine grace, and he felt immensely grateful to have walked alongside them throughout his life. When his condition worsened, Francis asked to be taken back to Portiuncula, the small chapel where it all had begun. He wanted to spend his last days there, in the place he considered the heart of his mission. The Portiuncula, with its simplicity and austerity, reflected everything that Francis had loved and defended. Ali, within those modest walls, he had experienced his first moments of profound conversion, and now he wished to conclude his earthly journey in the same place. The symbolism of this request was clear. Francis was returning to his origin, to the starting point of his walk with God, but now in a complete and full manner. On his deathbed, Francis asked for something that deeply touched the hearts of his brothers. He requested to be laid directly on the ground, without any mattress or blanket, in a final gesture of humility. For him, this contact with the earth was a way to honor his choice for poverty and simplicity until the last moment. By lying on the bare ground, Francis was completely surrendering himself to God's creation, like a child returning to the arms of his father. He was not afraid of death, and the act of lying on the ground symbolized his absolute acceptance of God's will, his desire to unite completely with the Creator. On the night of October 3rd, 1226, Francis, surrounded by his brothers, began to softly sing the verses of the Canticle of the Creatures. Even weak, his voice still brought a serene joy, a testament to his unwavering faith. As he sang, his brothers joined him, and in that moment, the small group of poor men he had gathered over the years felt God's presence in a nearly palpable way. Francis was about to depart, but his spiritual presence was becoming increasingly strong. In that moment of deep peace, Francis surrendered his spirit. There were no laments or despair. His death was a smooth transition, marked by the same simplicity that defined his entire life. The brothers present felt they had witnessed something sacred, something that transcended death. Francis had departed, but the love, joy, and simplicity he had lived would continue to inspire generations. After his death, the brothers immediately realized the greatness of the man who had been among them. Francis was not just a saint, he was a living example of how the gospel could be lived in fullness. He had shown that true holiness was not in great gestures or miracles, but in the ability to love deeply, to serve with humility, and to see God in all things. His body was taken to Assisi, and his burial was accompanied by a crowd of people who already considered him a saint. The entire city paused to pay homage to one who, during his life, had become a symbol of peace, humility, and love. The funeral procession passed through the streets where Francis had walked as a young man before his conversion, and many present remembered his carefree youth. Now, that man who had renounced everything rested in the arms of God, and his presence was still felt in every corner of Assisi. Francis's death was not the end of his mission, but the beginning of a legacy that would endure for centuries. His teachings, his example of life, and his profound spirituality continue to touch hearts around the world, reminding everyone that, as he demonstrated, the path to holiness passes through humility, unconditional love, and total acceptance of God's will in every moment of life. After the death of Francis of Assisi, the city that had seen him born and transform into one of the greatest icons of Christian spirituality began to vibrate with an atmosphere of reverence. His body was carried through the streets of Assisi, where crowds gathered to give a final farewell. People touched the simple garments that covered his body, some crying, others praying. For many, Francis was not just a holy man, he was the living mirror of Christ, someone who had brought to the modern world an evangelical radicality that the Church, in its vast corridors of power, seemed to have lost. Each step of the funeral procession was marked by a feeling of deep devotion, and the very air of the city seemed heavy with the presence of something sacred. But Francis, in his simplicity, had never sought this kind of recognition. Even in life, he avoided any display of greatness or veneration that his followers tried to impose on him. The last thing he wanted was to be remembered as an unattainable saint, someone distant from the realities of ordinary life. On the contrary, Francis had lived to be the least of men, someone who, by approaching the poor and marginalized, saw in them the face of Christ. His greatness lay precisely in his desire to fade away, to allow God to shine through his life. However, the impact of his death was as overwhelming as that of his life. In the days following his passing, the news of Francis's death spread rapidly throughout Italy and beyond. Men and women who had never even seen the saint began to speak of him with remarkable familiarity. Devotion to Francis blossomed among peasants, small merchants, and those living on the fringes of society. His name would soon be whispered in prayers made by simple people, those to whom he had dedicated his life. The lesser brothers, although deeply shaken by the loss of their founder, knew that Francis's work was not complete. The fraternity he had created with so much love and sacrifice needed to continue. Francis had entrusted divine providence to guide his brothers, and that spirit of surrender was now the legacy they had to carry forward. In the days that followed Francis's death, the brothers gathered at the Porziuncola, the small sanctuary that had been the spiritual heart of the Franciscan mission. There, around the simple tomb of their founder, they prayed and strengthened one another, knowing that the weight of their mission was great, but that with faith they could carry it forward. One of the first challenges that the fraternity faced was the very canonization of Francis. His followers, as well as the people, were convinced of his sanctity, and it wasn't long before reports of miracles began to be attributed to him. The sick who touched the place of his burial claimed that their ailments had been cured. Francis's fame spread quickly, and soon the pressure for his canonization reached the ears of Pope Gregory IX. The Pope, who had known Francis personally and had been deeply touched by his humility and fervor, had no doubts when he initiated the canonization process. In July 1228, less than 2 years after his death, Francis of Assisi was declared a saint. The canonization ceremony was held in Assisi, and the city, which had already considered Francis a saint long before the official recognition, celebrated the event with a mix of joy and reverence. For the inhabitants of Assisi, it was not just the recognition of a great man. It was confirmation that one of their own had achieved God's favor in an extraordinary way. However, even in the face of this extraordinary honor, the essence of Francis's life, the simplicity and detachment, remained alive in his brothers. They knew that the greatest tribute they could pay to their founder was to continue living according to the spirit of the gospel, without being swayed by the honors or the fame that now surrounded Francis's name. Each lesser brother remained committed to radical poverty, service to the poor, and unconditional love for creation, knowing that this was the true legacy of Francis. Meanwhile, the construction of the Basilica of Saint Francis in Assisi was initiated, a grand project that would symbolize both popular devotion and the continuation of the Franciscan mission. For some brothers, however, the contrast between the grandeur of the basilica and the simple lifestyle that Francis had always preached was disconcerting. Those majestic walls, destined to house Francis's body, seemed far removed from the small portiuncula where he had always preferred to be. But somehow, the Church found ways to balance the desire to honor its new saint with the essence of his message. As the construction progressed, Francis's influence continued to spread. New Franciscan convents began to emerge throughout Europe, attracting men and women from all social classes. The Franciscan spirit propagated with extraordinary force, carrying its message of humility and love to the farthest reaches of the continent. In every new place where a Franciscan fraternity was established, the values of Francis, the simplicity, care for the poor, and reverence for creation, were renewed and lived out in concrete ways. The Poor Clares, the female order founded by Clare of Assisi under the inspiration of Francis, also grew, and Clare, who would live for over 20 more years after Francis's death, dedicated herself fervently to preserving the original spirit of absolute poverty. She fought to ensure that the Franciscan rule, which she and her sisters followed with such love, remained true to the ideal that Francis valued so highly. Clare was, in a way, the spiritual guardian of Francis's legacy, and her commitment to extreme simplicity helped keep the flame of the founder alive among the poor clerks. The canonization of Francis and the construction of the basilica did not overshadow what he most desired, that his message spread not only among the religious but among common people. And so it was. Ordinary men and women, workers, peasants, people from all social classes found in Francis a renewed hope. He showed them that holiness was not reserved for the great masters of the church or the powerful, but that every person, in their simplicity, in their daily struggles, could live the gospel fully. Over the years, Francis's message spread not only through his followers, but also through the writings and sermons that conveyed his teachings. The Canticle of the Creatures, composed in the last years of his life, began to be recited and sung everywhere, a hymn to the beauty of creation and the gratitude that Francis had always cultivated. This simple yet profoundly spiritual poetry captured the heart of his message, an unconditional love for God, for nature, and for humanity. However, Francis's legacy was not without challenges. As the order grew, internal divisions also emerged. Some brothers, wishing to adapt the Franciscan rule to a less austere life, began to question the viability of living so radically poor. Francis, in his final years of life, had already expressed concern about this type of movement within his order. But even after his death, tensions continued. Internal disputes over the interpretation of the Franciscan rule would eventually lead to divisions and even schisms within the order. Nevertheless, the core of Francis's message remained intact, and his most faithful followers continued to live according to the values he preached with such passion. Today, as we look at the life of Francis of Assisi, we see more than a distant and idealized saint. We see a man who, amid his own weaknesses and limitations, sought to live the gospel in a radical and unreserved way. His message, even centuries after his death, continues to resonate, not only in the halls of the great churches and basilicas that bear his name, but in the hearts of millions of people who, like him, seek to find God in simplicity, service, and love for others. The year was 1224, and Francis of Assisi, already worn down by illness and years of rigorous austerity, was experiencing an inner anguish that transcended physical pain. He felt that his body was becoming increasingly fragile, but it was his soul that was undergoing a profound transformation. At this point in his spiritual journey, Francisco's desire to fully conform to the image of the crucified Christ intensified. He had spent years preaching the message of poverty and fraternal love, completely dedicating himself to the service of God and the needy. But something in his heart told him that he had not yet fully experienced what it meant to follow in the footsteps of Jesus to the end. The decision to withdraw to Mount Alverne that year was not just a quest for physical isolation. Francisco was on an inner pilgrimage, seeking a deeper form of communion with God. Mount Alverne was a place of great spiritual significance for him and his brothers, a place of solitude where he could completely detach from the world and immerse himself in the deep waters of contemplation. There, in the heights of the mountain, far from the noise and distractions of daily life, Francisco sought an intimacy with Christ that transcended words and actions. He desired a total union, a fusion of his life with the passion of Jesus. The days that followed his arrival at Mount Alverne were marked by a silence that bordered on the supernatural. Francisco and his few retreat companions knew that something was about to happen, but none of them could foresee the magnitude of what was to come. Alone in prayer, during the darkest hours of the night, Francisco surrendered completely to the mystery of the cross. His prayers, once filled with words, became deep groans and sighs, as if his spirit were being shaped by pain and divine love at the same time. It was then, on September 14th of the year 1224, during the celebration of the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross that Francisco had a vision that would change his life forever. In the midst of his fervent prayer, he saw before him a crucified seraph, radiant with light, yet at the same time enveloped in infinite pain. The crucified Christ, with seraphim wings, looked at Francisco with a love and compassion that penetrated to the depths of his soul. In that moment, Francisco understood that he was being called to participate in the Passion of Christ in a more direct and intimate way than he had ever imagined. Upon awakening from his vision, Francisco felt excruciating pain in his hands, feet, and side. Looking at himself, he realized that his body had been marked by the 5 wounds of Christ, the stigmata. The pain was intense, yet at the same time it brought with it a profound peace, as if Francisco had finally attained what his soul had always sought, a complete union with the redemptive suffering of Jesus. He who had lived his entire life in imitation of Christ now bore in his own body the visible signs of this spiritual conformity. The stigmata, however, were not merely physical marks. They represented the final and most painful stage of his total surrender to God. Francisco, who had shed all worldly riches and prestige, was now shedding himself, offering even his body as a living sacrifice. He knew that those signs were not meant to be displayed as trophies of holiness. They were an invitation to live the Passion of Christ in an even more radical way. In the months that followed, Francisco tried to hide the stigmata, keeping them covered and speaking little about them, even to his closest brothers. For him, the wounds were an intimate manifestation between him and God, and he feared that the attention they might attract would divert focus from his message, the simplicity of the gospel and selfless love for others. The physical pain caused by the stigmata was constant and debilitating. Francisco, already exhausted from years of penance and fasting, began to feel his body rapidly withering. Yet he continued to live each day with a serene joy, a surrender that transcended the understanding of those around him. His brothers noticed that, despite the deterioration of his health, Francisco radiated a peace that could only come from someone deeply united with God. He never complained about his pains, nor sought relief from the suffering he faced. On the contrary, he embraced them as part of his vocation to follow Christ to the end. As Francisco faced these physical and spiritual trials, the future of his fraternity was also at stake. The Order of the Friars Minor had grown exponentially in recent years, and many of the new members began to question the viability of living according to the strict rule that Francisco had established. Some argued that the order should seek greater structuring, perhaps even a certain relaxation of the practices of extreme poverty to ensure long-term survival. For Francisco, however, this was a dangerous temptation, something that could compromise the essence of his mission. He feared that the spirit of simplicity and humility would be lost in the pursuit of an institutionalization that would inevitably bring with it the traps of power and prestige. This internal dilemma between the desire to maintain the purity of the order and the practical need to adapt it to growth was one of the heaviest burdens Francisco carried. He saw with some sadness that the ideal that had been the center of his life and mission was under threat, and this deeply concerned him. However, as always, Francisco entrusted everything to God's hands, trusting that the Holy Spirit would guide his fraternity even in his absence. He was unwilling to compromise his principles, but he also knew that his journey was nearing its end and that he could not control future developments. In the months that followed the reception of the stigmata, Francisco withdrew even further into prayer and contemplation. He knew that the time he had left was short, and he wanted to make the most of every moment to deepen his union with God. His brothers noticed that he spoke less and less about earthly concerns and more about the joy of encountering the Lord. Francis did not fear death. On the contrary, he awaited it with expectation, knowing that it would be the gateway to the fullness of life in God. In his last days, when he was already gravely weakened, Francis asked to be taken back to Porciuncula. This request was not casual. Porciuncula, that small, humble chapel on the outskirts of Assisi, was for him the heart of his vocation. It was there that he had experienced the first moments of his conversion, and it was there that he wanted to end his journey. For Francis, that space represented everything he loved most: simplicity, detachment, closeness to God and to his brothers. Even surrounded by the fame that His Holiness had attracted, Francis desired to depart in the same way he had lived, simply, humbly, anonymously in the eyes of the world, but profoundly known by God. Upon arriving at Porciuncula, Francis asked to be laid directly on the bare ground, in contact with the earth. That final gesture of surrendering completely to creation was the ultimate symbol of his renunciation of everything earthly. He had begun his spiritual journey by renouncing material wealth, and now, at the moment of his death, he renounced even the comfort of a bed. For Francis, this was the purest way to imitate the poor Christ whom he loved so much. On the night of October 3rd, 1226, Francis, surrounded by his brothers, surrendered his spirit to God. His death was peaceful, like a gentle breath that fades away, and those who were by his side felt that, at that moment, something sacred had occurred. Francis departed in the same manner he had lived, with simplicity, joy, and unwavering faith. He left no riches or possessions, but he left a spiritual legacy that would transform the world forever. After the death of Francis of Assisi, the small village of Assisi found itself enveloped in a mix of deep mourning and a sense of something transcendent. It was not just the loss of a holy man, but the departure of someone who, in his fragility and humility, had touched the hearts of all who knew him. His brothers, the first to feel the pain of this separation, gathered around his body to perform the final rites, wrapped in a silent sadness, but also in a joy that only those who had lived closely with Francis could understand. He had lived exactly as he preached, faithful to the simplicity of the gospel until the very last moment. Francis's body was taken to the Church of St. George in Assisi, where the people had already gathered in large numbers to pay their respects. The fame of His Holiness had spread rapidly, and crowds of ordinary people came from all over to see for the last time the man who, in his radical poverty, had become a symbol of God's love for the poor and marginalized. That same Church of St. George, where he had learned to read and write as a child, now housed his lifeless body, a symbol of how Francis's journey had begun in Assisi and, in a sense, had always been rooted in the simplicity of his hometown. Among the people crowding around Francis' body was Clare of Assisi, the woman who had been his most faithful spiritual companion. Clare, who continued to lead the community of the Poor Clares, had lived the Franciscan ideal with the same intensity as Francis. The relationship between the two was marked by profound respect and a mutual devotion to poverty, but also by a spiritual friendship that transcended any earthly limits. Upon seeing Francis' body, enveloped in humility even in the final act of his life, Clare leaned down, gently touching his garments and whispering a prayer of gratitude. She knew that Francis' presence would never leave Assisi, and that in a way he would continue to guide her and all who followed in his footsteps. The news of Francis' death quickly reached Pope Gregory IX, who had already held a deep respect for the saint while he was still alive. The Pope, aware of the spiritual magnitude of Francis' life, moved quickly to canonize him. There were no lengthy debates or questions about his holiness. Francis' testimony had already spoken for itself over the years. The canonization ceremony took place in July of 1228, less than 2 years after his death, a remarkably swift timeframe by the standards of the Church. For the people of Assisi, the official canonization was merely a formality, for to them Francis had already been a saint long before his departure. However, while Francis's canonization brought a sense of global recognition from the Church, internally, the Franciscan order began to experience tensions. The rapid growth of the order brought with it challenges that Francis had anticipated in the last years of his life. With the increasing number of lesser brothers and the expansion into other regions, voices within the order began to question the feasibility of continuing to live by the strict rules of absolute poverty. Some believed that to ensure long-term survival, it would be necessary to adapt the Franciscan rules, allowing the order to receive donations and property. These tensions were not just practical matters, but also spiritual ones. For many of Francis's early companions, any change in the rule represented a betrayal of the original ideal that had been lived with such sacrifice. Fray Elias de Cortona, who took on a leadership role after the death of Francis, was one of those who believed that the order needed a more solid structure capable of ensuring the continuity and growth of the fraternity. Although he deeply respected Francis, Elias understood that to survive in an increasingly complex world, the order needed to adapt. On the other hand, there were brothers like Fray Leão, the confessor, and one of Francis's closest companions, who opposed any relaxation of the rule. Fray Leão had lived alongside Francis in the most difficult moments and knew his heart like few others. For him, compromising the vow of poverty would be like extinguishing the living flame that Francis had ignited in the heart of the Church. The dispute between these two currents within the order created a tension that would last for years, and in many respects, it was a question that Francis had already sensed in his last moments of life. Despite these internal disputes, Francis's legacy did not diminish. On the contrary, his message of simplicity and love for the poor continued to resonate not only within the Church but throughout society. In the medieval context, a society deeply marked by inequality and class divisions, Francis became a model of reconciliation between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the weak. His example showed that true wealth was not in material possessions, but in a life dedicated to God and to others. Meanwhile, the construction of the Basilica of Saint Francis in Assisi began to take shape. Designed to be a major pilgrimage center, the basilica quickly became a symbol of Francis's holiness. However, many of his early followers, including Clara and Fray Leão, viewed with some sadness the contrast between the simplicity that Francis preached and the grandeur of the project. Clara, in particular, kept her small community true to the original spirit of radical poverty, rejecting any attempts to transform the Franciscan life into something she believed went against Francis's wishes. The basilica, however, became inevitable. Its impact on Christianity in Europe was immense. Pilgrims from all over the continent began to travel to Assisi, eager to visit the place where Francis had been buried and to feel the spiritual presence he had left there. Many of these pilgrims were ordinary people who found in Francis a source of inspiration for their own lives. Francis had lived and died as a poor man, and this identification with the simplest was what attracted crowds to his tomb. Over the years, the basilica became a site of countless miracles and healings, further solidifying Francis's figure as a powerful intercessor between God and man. But at the same time, Francis's message remained alive not so much in the marbles and altars of the basilica, but in the hearts of those who lived his teachings. The lesser brothers, despite internal divisions, continued to spread Francis's message throughout Europe, creating new fraternities and taking the gospel to the most distant corners. In parallel, Clara of Assisi, who survived Francis for more than 2 decades, continued to be the guardian of his legacy. She, more than anyone else, understood the spirit of poverty that Francis valued so much and dedicated herself until her last days to maintaining the purity of this ideal within the community of the Poor Clares. Even as the Franciscan order faced the pressures of growth and adaptations, Clara never succumbed to the temptation to ease the rules or compromise the vocation of poverty. Her firmness was a spiritual anchor for those who feared that the Franciscan ideal would be lost over time. Thus, the memory of Francis remained alive not only in the great churches and cathedrals, but in the hearts of those who, like him, sought to follow Christ in a radical way. His example was a light in a world marked by injustices and divisions, and his life continues to inspire those who, even today, long for a faith that is simpler, deeper, and more focused on the marginalized. Francis of Assisi, the man who had renounced everything to follow God's call, became one of the greatest saints in history, not because of his grand achievements, but because of his ability to love unconditionally and selflessly. Francis's journey did not end with his death. It continues to resonate through the centuries, in every person who, upon hearing his story, feels the desire to live with more simplicity, to serve others with greater generosity, and to find, in the poverty of spirit, the true richness of life.